Good evening and welcome to the Australian and New Zealand Environmental History Network Conference for 2020. I'm Dr. Margaret Cook from the University of the Sunshine Coast. I'm speaking to you tonight from the lands of the Yagara people in Ipswich, Queensland, and I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, as well as those of the lands from where you are joining us from. I'd now like to welcome our speaker, Carla Pascalei. Thanks, Carla.
To be joining colleagues from all around Australia and even other parts of the world. I'm speaking to you tonight from the lands of the Wathaurong people in southern Victoria, where the briny mangrove-studded Barwon River winds between grey-green sand dunes to meet the Southern Ocean, where pelicans, plovers and cockatoos soar above a tangle of moona trees and Bellarine yellow gum. Today I'm going to talk about the ways in which Australian parents and children have been impacted by environmentally linked crises. I'm talking here about the Black Summer bushfires, which began in late 2019 and smouldered for half a year. The COVID-19 pandemic, a global crisis which hit Australia around March 2020, and behind them, the slower moving crisis of climate change. So a little bit about me. I'm an oral historian of childhood and motherhood, but I increasingly believe in the 21st century we can no longer study families in isolation from the environments in which they live. So profound an impact does environmental change have upon parents and children's daily lives. I'm in the early stages of an interview-based project looking at families living through environmental crisis. Oh, thank you. Someone has just reminded me that we haven't put up the slideshow yet. Margaret, could you please stop sharing your screen? Thank you. And I will bring up mine. Excellent. Thank you to the audience member that reminded us of that important point. So yeah, to recap, I'm in the early stages of an interview-based project looking at families living through environmental crisis. And tonight, in the short time that we have, I'm going to touch upon some of the overarching themes of the research. And I've tried to give you a little bit more detail in some quotes on the slides and some sort of visual prompts for you to start thinking about how some of these broad themes might unfold. So what kinds of impacts have these crises had upon Australian families? I'd like to suggest that they're both tangible and intangible, short and long term. We know much more about the tangible impacts on health, housing and jobs. In economic terms, Australians have lost employment and regional economies have suffered because of the bushfires and pandemic. The physical impact of the fires has been significant as communities directly affected by the fires have lost homes, community facilities and workplaces. More than 10 million hectares were burnt and 34 people and at least 1 billion animals died directly as a result of the blaze. Smoke from the fires also killed 450 people, the Royal Commission has found, and affected 80% of the population, including parents and children. One new mother living in Sydney told me that her baby's first months of life were characterised by hiding inside. For much of the summer, they could barely venture outside as thick smoke blanketed the city. Another woman who was pregnant and living in Canberra told me of how her pregnancy was shaped by restrictions on her movement and an all-encompassing fear of how smoke could harm her baby in utero. So her quote is up on this slide now. And coronavirus has also obviously had health impacts, with over 27,000 cases nationwide and nearly 900 deaths from the pandemic. And like the bushfires, precautionary measures have enacted a significant toll in addition to those who have actually fallen ill or died. These tangible, easily measurable impacts tend to be what news media and government responses focus on. But in my work, I'm particularly interested in the effects that they have upon our emotional and cultural worlds. The crises of the past year have had enormous impacts on daily life. Across the country, families have felt the impacts of the coronavirus pandemic through intangible factors such as loss of social interaction and leisure activities, as well as the encroachment of work and school into the family home. And on the top right there, you see me and my children singing Happy Birthday with my parents at a distance. The normal divisions of family time and household spaces have had to be rearranged to accommodate government restrictions in ways that have particularly impacted upon parents and children. And we see hints of their short-term impacts upon spaces, relationships, activities, and emotions in these quotes from mothers on the slide here. Psychologists report rises in anxiety and depression among adults and children. And these crises have sparked an anxiety pandemic as stress has spread virally. Australians report that they are worried about their jobs, about their children's education and well-being, and about the future in an environmentally compromised world. These crises have had developmental impacts on children that we are still measuring. Ordinarily, children expand their territorial range as they grow older, and their sphere of confident movement radiates outwards from their home as their spatial competency grows. They might learn to walk to school by themselves, to ride their bike to the local park, to take public transport into town or city. These excursions in independent mobility are often done in the company of friends, extending relationships outside the family. But children have often been confined to the home, the backyard, or occasionally the local neighbourhood this year, particularly in Victoria. Their physical sphere has shrunk radically to their family within their home, though paradoxically, the virtual worlds of many children have enlarged through increased screen time. In addition to learning spatial competencies, children learn new skills and social competencies outside the family home. They might learn chassis and rules of social engagement in the school playground. They might master gross motor skills and group interactions when they play in team sports. But all of these competencies have been compromised for Australian children this year, particularly for Victorian children. It will take some time to measure their full impacts. The cultural impacts are perhaps hardest of all to measure, particularly as we're still living through them. I would argue that we are seeing the impacts of environmental crises on our cultural worlds already. A disaster is often understood as localised and temporary, but as environmental disasters become more frequent in a climate-changed world, these crises will begin to bleed into one another, as they already have this year. They will also become less place-bound, as we saw, for example, in this bushfire that exploded through state boundaries and that we understand as connected to what is happening in California. And of course, underpinning all these singular crises is the slow-moving, far-reaching crisis of climate change. As more and more people come to believe that climate change is here and happening now, it exerts a greater cultural influence. And I believe it's changing parenthood and childhood in ways that will be enduring. For more and more women, climate change is impacting upon their mothering decisions and practices. Some women are choosing not to mother or limiting family size because they're worried about the kind of planet the current generation of children will inherit. And we see this concern in the quote from Paula at the top. Some are forming organisations like Birth Strike in the UK or Conceivable Futures in the US, where they refuse to have children until the climate crisis is solved. Still others are raising their children in ways that are impacted by their environmental beliefs, whether that is moving to places they feel will be more sheltered from the impacts of climate change or trying to instill environmental values through their parenting. And we see that in the quotes from Sarah and Anna here. While parenthood is undoubtedly changing in a climate-stricken world, it is the impacts upon children that are possibly more evident. Cultural impacts are hardest of all to measure, but I'd like to suggest that when we listen to the experiences of young people like Kira quoted here, we are hearing not just the effects of crises upon daily experiences and emotion. The cumulative effects of these periods of prolonged stress for children and young people may be a profound cultural shift in how youth is experienced. We may be raising the first generation of children without a childhood, in the sense that childhood in the industrialised world is usually envisaged as a time of innocence, free from the pressures and worries of the adult world. As Greta Thunberg angrily declared, adults are stealing the childhood of young people alive today. Instead of dreaming of their futures, many young people are fighting for their survival. But I would like to end on an optimistic note and to connect my paper to the themes of this conference recovery, restoration, renewal, and resistance. Total recovery from this year of crisis may not be possible. It may not be possible to go back to the way things were. But as many have argued, that may be a good thing if our previous lives were unsustainable. Activists are rising, parents and children particularly, who are determined to create a different future from the ashes of the present. And we see this in groups like Extinction Rebellion Families, Australian Parents for Climate Action, Australian Youth Climate Coalition, or Seed Indigenous Youth Climate Network. Increasingly, parents are seeking to raise their children differently, in ways that are more in touch with the planet, its plants and its creatures. And more importantly, for some, we are seeing a reversal of the ageism that has long characterised our society, with its assumption that adults must always teach children. Instead, we are witnessing a growing acknowledgement that children, with their passionate idealism and engagement with nature on its own terms rather than for its use value, may have much to teach their elders about how to tread lightly on the earth. Thank you.